The most disturbing moment in Bret Michaels' story did not happen inside a hospital. It happened on a stage. August 21st, 2026, Sugar Hill, Georgia. Bret walked back into the lights after weeks away. The band was there, the crowd was there, the bandana was there. And for a little while everything probably looked reassuringly familiar. That is precisely what makes what happened next so revealing. Because after that comeback performance, doctors and paramedics evaluated him and reached a conclusion Bret apparently had not wanted to reach himself. He needed to stop, not slow down, not shorten a few shows, stop. His remaining performances for 2026 were cancelled, and his physicians said he needed several months of rest and gradual recovery after recent surgeries. They specifically pointed to the summer heat, humidity, and the effect those conditions could have on his blood sugar. And there is something about that sequence that deserves more attention than the cancellation itself. Bret had already been told to recover. Then he came back. Then his body, or perhaps the people standing beside him watching his body, effectively overruled him. That is where I think this story really begins, not with poison, not with the hair metal years, not even with the medical catastrophe that nearly killed him 16 years earlier. It begins with a 63-year-old man apparently discovering that determination and recovery are not always the same thing. Bret later acknowledged that he may have returned sooner than he should have. He explained that his desire and energy wanted him playing music, while the practical realities of a coast-to-coast flight, summer heat, blood sugar and blood pressure told a different story. Read that carefully. Because Bret Michaels has built almost his entire public identity around one principle: keep moving. Pain? Keep moving. Setback? Keep moving. Hospital? Get healthy and keep moving. That philosophy helped create his career. Now it may be the very philosophy his doctors are asking him to temporarily abandon, and that's much harder than merely cancelling concerts. If you grew up with Poison, you probably remember Bret as something almost permanently kinetic. He didn't simply sing, he bounced across stages, he talked fast, he smiled through interviews. He seemed designed to make stillness look unnatural. Even his vocabulary remains built around motion. Rock on, stay strong, remain unbroken. There is nothing wrong with those words. They have probably helped him survive things that would psychologically flatten many people. But here's the detail I keep coming back to. What happens when unbroken starts meaning that you refuse to sit down? There's another way to look at what happened in Georgia. The heartbreaking part isn't that Bret Michaels couldn't finish 2026 on the road. The heartbreaking part may be that somebody else had to tell Bret Michaels it was finally acceptable not to, because only a month earlier, his body had already sent a fairly brutal warning. He had been suffering from a kidney stone, not a minor inconvenience, a complicated obstructing stone that eventually required immediate surgery and placement of a ureteral stent. But before the hospital came, the concerts. Bret said he waited nearly 7 days for the stone to pass. It didn't. The pain intensified, and he kept performing. Charleston, Grantville, then a private performance at Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane. Only after that show did he go to the hospital because the pain had become too much. Fans hear that and instinctively think, what a fighter. I understand why, but I'm not sure that's the only thing we should hear. Sometimes the quality that saves a person becomes the quality that makes it difficult for them to recognize their limits. And with Bret Michaels, that pattern goes much further back than one kidney stone. Much further. Because 16 years earlier, his body had already tried to teach him essentially the same lesson. And Bret's answer then was remarkably familiar. Get up. Get back out there. Keep going. Only this time, at 63, the distance between resilience and recklessness is becoming harder to ignore. There is a photograph of Bret Michaels that means more now than it did a few months ago. In April 2026, he returned to Pittsburgh for the NFL draft. Big crowd. Music. Family. A hometown moment. Bret described it as a bucket list experience. But he also pointed out something extraordinary. It happened almost exactly 16 years after the week he suffered a life-threatening brain hemorrhage. 16 years. That should make the Pittsburgh appearance feel triumphant, and it does. But after what happened this summer, it also feels strangely circular. Because the Bret Michaels who walked onto that stage carried something the audience couldn't see, a medical history that would sound exaggerated if a screenwriter invented it. He has lived with type 1 diabetes since childhood, diagnosed when he was 6 years old. That alone means decades of measuring, calculating, adjusting. Food, insulin, exercise, travel, stress, sleep, heat. A rock concert looks spontaneous from the audience. For a type 1 diabetic, spontaneity has mathematics hidden underneath it, and that's a part of Bret's image that the cameras rarely capture. Then came 2010. First, an emergency appendectomy. Less than 2 weeks later, Bret was at home when an overwhelming headache struck. He later described it as something beyond an ordinary migraine. Doctors discovered a subarachnoid hemorrhage, bleeding around the brain. He was critically ill. Then, during the recovery period, another warning arrived. Facial numbness, another hospital, a small stroke. Testing subsequently revealed a patent foramen oval, essentially an opening between chambers of the heart that had not closed normally. That condition was believed to have contributed to the stroke, and Bret later underwent a procedure to close it. Now notice what usually happens when this part of his biography gets told. The storyteller says Bret nearly died, then emphasizes how quickly he came back. That's the inspirational version. And yes, it's true. But maybe we've been paying attention to the wrong half of the sentence. He nearly died. Then he came back extraordinarily quickly. Even in 2010, doctors and observers were asking whether he might be returning too soon. Yet Bret appeared at the Celebrity Apprentice finale and soon resumed touring plans. At the time, that felt heroic. America loves this archetype, the fighter, the man who gets knocked down and refuses to stay there. Rock music loves it even more. Pain becomes proof, scars become credentials, survival becomes performance. And Bret Michaels may embody that mentality better than almost anyone from his generation, but age changes the meaning of certain behaviors. At 47, recovering quickly looks defiant. At 63, after decades of diabetes and repeated medical interventions, pushing through intense pain until surgery becomes necessary can look different. Not weaker, different. This matters because Bret himself has spent years shaping survival into part of his identity. He doesn't speak about illness like a passive patient. He speaks about it like an opponent, something to beat, something to outwork, something that gets another motivational slogan and then gets left behind in the rearview mirror. I admire part of that. I question another part. Because the body isn't particularly impressed by mythology. It doesn't know you sold millions of records. It doesn't care that every rose has its thorn can make an arena sing together 38 years later. And it certainly does not care that thousands of people bought tickets. Blood sugar rises or falls anyway. A ureter becomes obstructed anyway. Recovery takes however long recovery takes. That's the quiet humiliation hidden inside aging for people whose identities were built on physical endurance. Eventually, effort stops controlling every outcome. And if you have followed Bret for decades, you may already sense where this becomes emotional. He isn't merely being asked to recover from surgery. He is being asked to become a version of Bret Michaels that the public has almost never seen. Still, dependent, patient, maybe even uncertain. And for some people, waiting is harder than fighting. To understand why stopping hurts Bret Michaels so much, you don't really need to begin with his illnesses. You need to begin with poison, but not where you'd expect. Forget the makeup for a moment. Forget the teased hair, Sunset Strip mythology, MTV excess and all the visual shorthand people now use to reduce an entire musical era to a costume party. Listen instead to the personality underneath it. Poison survived because they were hungry, almost embarrassingly hungry. They weren't treated as sophisticated. Critics didn't need them to be. Their audience didn't either. They were built around immediacy. You walked into the room. You gave everything. You won the audience before someone else did. Bret became exceptionally good at that, and once you've spent decades being rewarded for never holding anything back, moderation can feel suspiciously similar to surrender. That's the piece people miss when they say, "Why doesn't he just rest?" Because just rest sounds simple only if performing is something you do. For Bret, performing appears closer to something he is. Even in 2024, when announcing that he intended to limit his 2025 performances and focus more on his health and diabetes, he joked that he was like a classic muscle car, still fast, still fun, simply requiring more maintenance. It's a funny line. It's also more revealing than he may have intended. A muscle car exists to move. You service it so it can return to the road. You don't put it permanently under a cover. Bret's conception of health seems repeatedly tied to usefulness. Get better, so I can perform. Recover, so I can return. Fix this, so I can go again. Even his July 2026 message after surgery followed that instinct. He thanked his doctors and nurses, said the operation was complete, then immediately turned toward doing everything possible to feel better and continue playing shows once he received a clean bill of health. That sounds perfectly reasonable, except we know what happened next. He was ordered to take several weeks off. He returned in August. One show. Then doctors pulled him back. That's why the August 21st performance matters so much. It wasn't simply a comeback that failed. It exposed the conflict inside the man. Bret's mind appears to operate according to the rules that made him successful. If there's a stage, make the stage. If people are counting on you, don't disappoint them. If it hurts, push through. If life knocks you down, show everybody you're still standing. Except recovery has a completely different rule book. Sometimes the victory is cancelling. Sometimes strength looks embarrassingly like going home. And nobody cheers when you do that. Think about it. When Bret performed through pain, people could applaud. When Bret returned in Georgia, people could cheer. When Bret agrees to months of recovery. No spotlight, no guitar, no crowd chanting his name, just time. For someone wired like him, that may be the harder arena. And there's another reason this moment feels heavier. Poison itself has been hovering around the possibility of another chapter. Earlier in 2026, Bret publicly discussed possible offers for a Poison reunion in 2027 and stressed that for him, Poison meant the 4 original members. C. DeVille, Bobby Dole, Ricky Rocket, and himself. He even said he had a good feeling they would attempt to make it work. So imagine the emotional timing. One eye looking toward a possible reunion. One body suddenly forcing a long interruption. No confirmed farewell. No announcement that Poison is finished. Nothing that dramatic. And perhaps that's what makes it more human. People rarely receive a clean warning that one period of their lives is ending. Usually something smaller happens. A postponed show, a doctor's instruction, a flight that hits harder than it used to, recovery that takes longer than expected. The body quietly changes the terms. Then the person has to decide whether to change with it. If you're watching this because Poison belonged to your youth, there's a strange mirror here. Bret is aging in public. So are the people who first heard him on cassette tapes on MTV, in cars, at parties, in bedrooms with posters on the wall. Maybe that's why seeing a rock star forced to rest can feel unexpectedly personal. We aren't only watching Bret confront limitation, we're remembering when none of us thought limitation applied to us. There is another Bret Michaels story unfolding at exactly the same time, and it complicates everything. On August 25th, while headlines were still circulating about his cancelled shows, Bret's website announced that he would personally sponsor a child living with type 1 diabetes to attend Camp No Coma, and a young adult to attend a Ties for Tim adventure retreat. The timing caught my attention. 4 days after his attempted comeback, 3 days after the announcement that doctors were taking him off the road, and he was already redirecting attention toward somebody else's diabetes. That's not a detail I'd throw away, because when celebrity health stories are told badly, illness becomes spectacle. Hospital photograph, concerned headline, dramatic music. Then everybody moves on. Bret has done something different with diabetes for years. He has made it part of his public service. When he won Celebrity Apprentice in 2010, prize money went toward the American Diabetes Association. His advocacy around type 1 diabetes has continued long after that television moment ended. And here's where I slightly disagree with the easy, tragic rock star framing. Bret Michaels is not tragic because illness defeated him. At least we have no evidence of that. He's recovering. His team explicitly says they expect him back healthy and strong. There has been no terminal diagnosis announced, no final farewell, no reason to invent one. The tragedy, if we're going to use that word, is quieter. It's that the same instinct that made his life enormous may now have to be renegotiated if he wants to keep that life. And apparently Bret understands that better when talking about other people than when talking about himself. That's human. We're often excellent at giving others permission to slow down, terrible at granting ourselves the same permission. Look at what happened in July. 7 days waiting for a stone to pass. Intense pain. Shows anyway. Then surgery. Afterward gratitude. Then the drive to return. In August, comeback. Medical evaluation. Stop again. That pattern tells us more than any dramatic headline could. Bret doesn't appear frightened of work. He appears frightened of losing momentum. I can't prove what he feels privately, and neither can anyone watching from outside. But behavior creates a pattern even when psychology remains unknowable, and his pattern has been remarkably consistent. Move toward the audience. Move toward the next show. Turn survival into forward motion. There is something beautiful in that. There is also something sad. Because eventually every survivor discovers that survival isn't measured only by how quickly you stand back up. Sometimes it is measured by whether you are willing to stay down long enough to actually heal. And Bret has already received versions of this warning. In 2010, his body delivered several of them within weeks. Emergency appendectomy, brain hemorrhage, stroke, heart defect, procedure. Then life resumed. Years later, kidney problems interrupted touring again. Now another obstructing stone, surgery, and another medically enforced pause. These aren't all one disease. They shouldn't be falsely connected into some ominous diagnosis. That's important. But together, they create a personal history in which the margin for ignoring warning signs feels increasingly expensive. Maybe you've known someone like that. A father who wouldn't miss work. A mother who cared for everyone except herself. A friend who treated exhaustion like evidence of character. People we call strong partly because they never inconvenience us with their vulnerability. Then one day, the body sends an invoice, and nobody can negotiate with it. That is what I see when I look at Bret Michaels in 2026. Not a fallen rock star, not a man saying goodbye, a man being confronted with an extraordinarily difficult possibility. Perhaps the strongest thing he can do now is something his entire career trained him not to do. Nothing. A few years ago, Bret Michaels described himself as a classic muscle car. It's easy to understand why that comparison appealed to him. Bright paint, big engine, still fast, still loud. A little more maintenance these days, then back onto the highway. But machines have one advantage people don't. You can replace nearly everything. Human beings accumulate. Every operation stays somewhere in the story, every scar, every scare, every year of insulin, every night in intensive care, every time somebody you love gets a phone call they never wanted. The body remembers even when the performer would rather move on. And maybe that is why I don't think the image from Bret's 2026 story that will matter most is the hospital gown. It's the August comeback. The man actually made it back. He stood on stage. He did what Bret Michaels has trained himself to do for most of his life. Then the show ended, and the adults in the room who understood what his body was telling them said enough. His doctors said there was a much-needed period of rest and slow recovery ahead. Bret himself later admitted he may have chosen to return sooner than he should have. That admission matters. It isn't dramatic. That's why it matters. For decades, Bret's mythology has depended on defeating the obstacle. This time, perhaps the obstacle isn't kidney surgery. Perhaps it's accepting that winning can look different at 63. He once survived a brain hemorrhage. He survived a stroke. He had a heart defect repaired. He has managed type 1 diabetes since childhood. Those experiences produced an understandable philosophy. I survived that. I can survive this. But survival can teach the wrong lesson if we're not careful. Surviving something once doesn't make the next risk harmless. Being strong doesn't make the body infinitely negotiable, and optimism, one of Bret's most attractive qualities, can occasionally hide information that fear would force us to notice. There is a sentence from Bret's recent update that captures the contradiction almost perfectly. His energy and soul want to play music. Of course they do. That's Bret. But the rest of him currently needs something else. Maybe the next chapter of his life depends on whether those two Bret Michaels can finally make peace with each other. The one who lives for the stage, and the one who has to live after the stage lights turn off. Poison fans are also waiting on another unresolved question. Could all four original members return together in 2027? Earlier this year, Bret sounded optimistic about trying to make that happen, although nothing was guaranteed. A few months ago, that question would have sounded like entertainment news. Who's touring? Who agreed? What cities? What songs? Now it lands differently. I don't find myself wondering first whether Bret can do another Poison tour. I wonder whether he can learn to protect the possibility of one. There is a difference. Maybe you've reached an age where you understand exactly what that means. When you're 25, opportunity feels like something you chase. Later in life, some opportunities survive only because you finally learn what not to chase. That may be the uncomfortable beauty in Bret Michaels' current moment. For years he taught his audience to remain unbroken. Maybe now he has an opportunity to redefine the word. Unbroken doesn't have to mean pretending nothing hurts. It doesn't mean performing through everything. It doesn't mean proving you can still do today what you did at 30. Sometimes, unbroken means knowing which parts of yourself are worth protecting before they actually break. And I wonder whether Bret sees that yet. Not the entertainer, not the businessman, not the front man thinking about 2027. Bret. The 6-year-old boy who learned early that staying alive required paying attention to his body. Somewhere between that boy and the rock star who performed through 7 days of worsening kidney pain, the lesson seems to have changed. Maybe it became, don't let the body stop you. Now at 63, perhaps life is asking him to remember the original version. Listen to it. If Bret eventually returns to a Poison stage, thousands of people will cheer. They should. But I suspect the more meaningful victory is happening far away from an arena right now. No pyro, no encore, no chorus of nothing but a good time. Just a man whose doctors finally convinced him to stay home long enough to recover. And for Bret Michaels, that may require more courage than walking onto any stage ever did. If you've followed Bret since the Poison years, tell me something in the comments. When you look at him now, do you see the same fighter you admired decades ago? Or has your definition of what makes someone a fighter changed too? Because maybe Bret Michaels' story isn't becoming heartbreaking because the music is ending. There is no evidence that it is. Maybe it hurts because we're watching someone discover in real time that loving the thing that gave your life meaning sometimes means having the discipline to step away from it. Not forever, just long enough. And strangely as that may be the hardest encore of all.